In the heart of the ancient world, where rivers carved life into the deserts and the skies blazed with suns that seemed eternal, there was a land unlike any other, Mesopotamia, cradle of gods and kings, of temples that rose toward heaven, and of whispers that sank into the underworld. Between the great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, civilization flourished, yet it was never free from shadows. Every city was built upon longing, every stone carried the mark of desire, and every myth was born from the ache of souls searching for connection. This is where our story begins, not with triumph, but with solitude. For even in the courts of kings, amidst gold and incense, loneliness lingered like a secret fragrance. Even in the raw expanse of wilderness, where beasts prowled and rivers sang, there pulsed an ancient yearning for touch, for recognition, for the embrace that would blur the boundaries between the human and the divine. The myths of Mesopotamia were not merely tales told by priests. They were confessions of the human heart, spoken in the language of gods. They carried truths that were too vast to be held by a single body, too sensual to be forgotten. And among them, one myth shimmers above the rest, the entwined story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, a story born from the clash between wild nature and human civilization, between domination and surrender, between solitude and companionship. Yet before the names are spoken, before the figures emerge in their full intensity, it is the world itself that must first be felt. Imagine a city of towering walls, Uruk, the pride of Sumer, girdled with bricks so strong that its very foundations seemed eternal. Within its gates, the hum of life resounded, the press of bodies in the market, the songs of priestesses in the temples, the pounding of hammers shaping bronze into weapons. Civilization was a fire burning bright, a beacon against the wilderness. And yet beyond the walls stretched the raw expanse of creation. Grasslands teeming with gazelles, forests alive with lions, rivers swelling with the voices of untamed gods. This was the tension of Mesopotamia, a land caught between order and chaos, between the polished brick and the wild reed. To live here was to always balance between what was built and what could never be tamed. To breathe here was to feel the ache of duality, the pull toward belonging, and the pull toward freedom. At the heart of this duality lay the theme of longing, for in every myth there was desire, not only the hunger of the body, although that was never far, but the hunger of the soul, the deep and aching need to find the one who sees, the one who mirrors, the one who makes the loneliness of existence bearable. The Sumerians understood this yearning. They carved it into their stories, painting love as both tender and consuming, companionship as both salvation and peril. They knew that to be human was to ache for another, and that this ache was sacred. The myth of Gilgamesh and Enkidu is not merely the tale of two men, it is the tale of desire itself, desire in its purest, most unguarded form. It is the story of what happens when the wild and the civilized meet, when one who rules seeks one who cannot be ruled, when loneliness finds its reflection and transforms into intimacy.
To feel this myth is to understand that every connection is a kind of collision. It begins with distance, with the vast space that separates one being from another. And in that distance there is pain, an emptiness that throbs quietly in the chambers of the heart. But then, in a moment of fate, two paths converge, and the collision is fierce, a struggle, a resistance, a recognition that trembles with danger and with beauty. From this collision, desire is born. From desire, intimacy. From intimacy, transformation. The ancients knew that the most sacred truths were not coldly spoken, but felt through the body, through breath, through touch, through the slow unraveling of solitude into closeness. That is why their myths throb with sensuality, not as decoration, but as essence. Desire is not separate from divinity, it is its pulse, its proof. To set the tone for this story, one must feel the eternal backdrop of Mesopotamia itself. The gods were not distant abstractions, but intimate presences woven into every act of daily life. The sun god Shamash lit the roads of justice. The goddess Inanna embodied both lust and war. The storm god Enlil raged and blessed in equal measure. To walk beneath the skies of Uruk was to be watched, desired, judged. To love was to step into the realm of gods.
And yet, even among gods, loneliness lingered. Even among kings, desire burned. Even among wild creatures, there was the ache to be understood. This is the paradox of existence, one that resonates through every heartbeat. No matter how powerful, no matter how free, no soul escapes the longing to find its counterpart. It is this paradox that makes the myth of Gilgamesh and Enkidu eternal. It is not just an old tale from crumbling tablets. It is a mirror held to the human heart, reflecting the eternal question, what do we hunger for most? Is it glory, power, or is it the embrace of another, the warmth that dissolves our solitude? The story will tell us that it is both, and that the two are never separate. For power without companionship is hollow, and desire without recognition is fleeting. Civilization without wildness is sterile, and wildness without belonging is lost. In the meeting of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the world found a union that could not be broken, until death itself came to claim its due. But that is still to come. For now we linger in the threshold, in the moment before encounter, when the air is charged with expectancy. We linger in the silence of Uruk's walls, in the rustle of grasses beyond, in the unspoken yearning that draws city and wilderness toward one another. This introduction is not an answer, but a question whispered through time, a question that every listener feels stirring inside them. Have you known loneliness so profound that it becomes a prayer for connection? Have you felt desire so deep it blurs the line between body and soul? Have you longed for someone who is both your rival and your reflection? Such questions are the soil from which myths grow, and from this soil rises the tale of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, shimmering like heat over the Mesopotamian sands. Here, the world is not merely a backdrop, it is alive,
pulsing with gods and longing, with beasts and bricks, with order and chaos, with touch and distance. It is the world where companionship is not simply comfort, but salvation, where desire is not weakness, but power, where intimacy is not fleeting, but transformative. This is the myth you are about to enter, one that begins in loneliness, burns with desire, and ends in the bittersweet truth of mortality. It is both eternal and intimate, both divine and human, both sensual and sacred. It is the myth of a king who sought, and of a wild man who answered. It is the myth of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and through their longing, it becomes the myth of us all.
To speak of this myth is to speak of two forces born different yet destined to collide. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and Enkidu, child of the wilderness. They are not simply men. They are living embodiments of the desires and contradictions that dwell within every soul. To know them is to feel the tension between what is tamed and what is untamed, between the walls of civilization and the breath of the open steppe. Let us begin with Gilgamesh. He was said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, a composition that alone marked him as extraordinary, yet also cursed him with incompleteness. From his divine lineage came beauty so radiant that no eye could turn away, strength so immense that no rival could match him, and a presence so commanding that his very silence was heavier than thunder. To look upon him was to feel at once admiration and unease, for his divinity glimmered through his mortal frame like a flame straining to escape the lamp that holds it. In Uruk, Gilgamesh was king, yet he was restless. His body was a vessel of endless vigor, his desires overflowing, his heart unsatisfied even by the splendors of the temple or the soft embrace of priestesses. He walked the walls of his city as if they were too narrow to contain him, as if even the sky above bowed to his disquiet. Every conquest he achieved, every body he subdued, every heart he bent to his will, only deepened the emptiness within. His aura was a paradox, radiant yet shadowed, powerful yet starved. The people of Uruk both adored and feared him. They whispered that his strength was unmatched, but they also murmured of his arrogance, his tyranny, the way his hunger for dominance left none untouched. And yet, within this hunger, there was something more fragile, a yearning, unnamed but palpable, for someone who could look at him not as a king, not as a god's child, but as a man. To imagine Gilgamesh is to imagine a body sculpted by gods, broad shoulders gleaming in the light of Shamash, hands that could crush stone, yet also linger with unsettling grace, a gaze that pierced through flesh and into the marrow of being. His beauty was not gentle, it was overwhelming, the kind that unsettles rather than soothes, the kind that promises ecstasy, yet threatens ruin. His presence was a storm wrapped in golden flesh, a storm that longed for the one who could stand within it without fear. And so we turn to Enkidu.
Unlike Gilgamesh,
Enkidu was not born within walls, but in the wild expanse beyond them. He was shaped by the gods, not as king, but as counterbalance. While Gilgamesh embodied the polished brilliance of civilization, Enkidu carried the raw pulse of nature itself. He was a creature of reeds and rivers, of winds that curled over the plains, of earth damp with morning dew. His body was covered in the hair of beasts, his muscles carved by the primal rhythms of survival, his movements fluid like those of a lion or a stag. The animals knew him as one of their own. Gazelles grazed without fear at his side, lions lay down in the grass when his shadow fell, and birds wheeled above him as though he were a landmark of their world. His presence was harmony, not command. He was not a master of the wild, but its brother. To touch him would be to feel the heat of sun on bare stone, the cool rush of river water, the roughness of bark, the pulse of the living earth. And yet Enkidu, too, carried longing. For though he was whole in the wilderness, untouched by walls or human desire, there was within him a space shaped by absence. The gods had created him for a purpose: to meet Gilgamesh, to be his equal, his mirror, his challenger, and his companion. Without knowing it, Enkidu bore the same loneliness as Gilgamesh, though it sang in a different key. Where Gilgamesh's solitude was sharp, gilded by power and dissatisfaction, Enkidu's was soft, veiled in innocence and unspoken yearning. Enkidu's beauty was not the polished gleam of divinity, but the raw allure of nature unbound. His body was unadorned, yet in its strength and vitality lay a sensuality that civilization could never manufacture. His eyes held the depth of untouched forests, his breath carried the scent of soil and rain. To see him was to be reminded of a time before temples, before crowns, before walls. Yet to feel him was to awaken the most human of desires, the longing to touch what is pure, to tame what resists, to merge with what stands outside oneself. Thus the stage was set. Two beings, alike in their loneliness, but opposite in their essence, were moving toward one another. Gilgamesh, the restless king whose touch of divinity left him hollow, and Enkidu, the wild man whose untouched nature was both innocence and temptation. The sensuality of their existence lies not only in their bodies, but in their magnetism, in the inevitability of their attraction. Civilization longs for wilderness even as it fears it. Wilderness yearns for recognition even as it resists capture. In Gilgamesh and Enkidu, these forces take form, destined to clash and embrace, destined to become inseparable. When the gods designed Enkidu, they wove him with textures meant to stir desire. Not only physical desire, but the deeper desire of recognition. His hair was thick and unbound, his skin sun-warmed and earth-scented, his strength undeniable yet never cruel. His silence spoke louder than commands, his freedom unsettled the certainty of cities. He was not made to bow, but to stand face to face with the king who bowed to no one. And Gilgamesh, in turn, was adorned with the majesty of divinity, yet pierced by the frailty of humanity. his lips curved with the arrogance of one who had never known defeat, but also with the longing of one who had never known equality. His voice carried the weight of gods, yet trembled when he was alone. His body was perfection, yet it was restless perfection, aching for the one who could press against him without yielding. In their very being, they called to one another. Before their eyes would meet, their essences already entwined like threads pulled together by fate. Gilgamesh's emptiness cried out for a wildness that could not be conquered, and Enkidu's innocence yearned for a gaze that would truly see him. One was the storm, the other the forest, and the collision of storm and forest was not destruction, but transformation. It is said that attraction begins before touch, before words, before sight. It begins in the soul, in the recognition of what has always been missing. That is how it was with Gilgamesh and Enkidu. They did not yet know each other, yet the world already trembled with their inevitability. The rivers rushed faster, the winds carried whispers, the gods leaned closer, for they knew that soon two forces would converge and nothing would remain unchanged. This, then, is the portrait of our two figures, a king and a wild man, divine majesty and natural vitality, each aching with loneliness, each carrying the seed of desire. They are not simply characters, they are archetypes of longing, reflections of ourselves. In Gilgamesh, we find the ache of restless power. In Enkidu, the purity of untamed being. Together, they are the promise of union, the union of opposites, of rivals, of souls that crash together not to break, but to become whole. And so, the myth waits at the edge of encounter. Their bodies, their essences, their hungers are prepared. The world has breathed them into being for this single purpose, that they should meet, struggle, and entwine. For only through one another can they escape the solitude that binds them. Only through one another can they taste the fullness of being alive.
Power, when left unchecked, begins to turn against itself. In the city of Uruk, this truth was carved into every whispered complaint, every unspoken prayer, every silent glance exchanged between the weary and the hopeful. Gilgamesh, the radiant king, had built his rule upon brilliance and strength. Yet that brilliance burned too hot, and that strength pressed too heavily upon the shoulders of his people. His divinity, instead of blessing, became a weight they could not bear. It is said that he claimed the first night of every bride, not out of love, but out of hunger for proof that none could deny him. It is said he worked his men beyond endurance, driven by an insatiable need to shape the city, as if the walls of Uruk could fill the hollow within him. His tyranny was not born of cruelty alone. It was born of restlessness, of yearning without direction, of a soul that could not find its reflection. Yet to his people it felt like chains, and their cries rose like smoke toward the gods. And the gods, who always listened when desire or suffering reached its breaking point, devised an answer. They would create for Gilgamesh a counterpart, a mirror, a rival who would humble him and perhaps heal him. Out of clay and breath, shaped by the mother goddess Aruru, Enkidu was called forth. Not as polished as Gilgamesh, not draped in crowns or robes, but clothed in wilderness, dripping with the untamed vitality of creation itself. While Gilgamesh prowled the streets of Uruk with a restless hunger, Enkidu ran with the gazelles in fields of grass. While the king's hands bent men to his will, Enkidu's hands pulled traps from hunters, freeing beasts that civilization sought to claim. Where Gilgamesh's footsteps echoed heavy against stone, Enkidu's feet whispered over earth. And yet, though they had never seen one another, the gods had already entwined their fates. For loneliness is not answered with distance, but with its reflection. And the loneliness of Gilgamesh demanded the presence of one who was his equal. The first whispers of Enkidu reached Uruk when hunters, frustrated at finding their traps empty, spoke of a wild man who tore them apart. They described a figure covered in hair, with strength like no human, who drank with beasts and ate the grass of the plains. They trembled not because he harmed them, but because his presence unbound what they sought to control. To the city, he was a threat. To the gods, he was an answer. To Gilgamesh, though he did not yet know it, he was destiny.
But before Enkidu could meet his king, he was softened by the lure of intimacy. The temple sent forth a woman, Shamhatu, whose touch was silk and whose presence carried the sacred art of desire. With her, Enkidu first tasted the depths of human connection, the ache of flesh meeting flesh, the unraveling of innocence into knowledge. For 6 days and 7 nights they lay entwined, and when he rose, the animals of the field no longer recognized him as their own. He had been altered by touch, by desire, by the awakening of a part of himself that had always longed for recognition. Through Shamhatu's embrace, Enkidu stepped across a threshold. He was no longer purely of the wild. He was now both, untamed yet touched by civilization, fierce yet softened by longing. It was not enough to make him less himself. It was enough to prepare him for Gilgamesh. For only one who had tasted intimacy could recognize its absence in another. Only one who had been awakened by desire could meet desire's mirror. And so the day came when Enkidu entered Uruk. The people rejoiced, for they sensed the wild man would confront their king. Whispers passed like sparks, carried on the wind. He is strong enough to stand against Gilgamesh. He is untamed enough to face him. Perhaps he is the answer to our prayers. Gilgamesh, restless and unknowing, walked the streets that day with his usual command, claiming what he wished as though the city existed only to feed his hunger. But then, in the dust of the roads, another figure stood, broad, fierce, eyes burning with the fire of untouched wilderness. Enkidu. The moment they beheld one another, the world seemed to hold its breath.
Here were two forces, each overwhelming in his own right, each accustomed to dominance, each carrying an emptiness that demanded an equal. Gilgamesh's gaze narrowed, not in scorn, but in recognition. Enkidu's stance stiffened, not in fear, but in defiance. They clashed. Their bodies collided like storm against mountain, like river against stone. Dust rose around them, and the people gasped, for never had they seen their king resisted, never had they seen his power matched. Gilgamesh pushed, his muscles straining, his divine blood surging. Enkidu resisted, his wild strength unyielding, his breath hot with primal fire.
It was a battle of bodies, but beneath the violence, something deeper pulsed. Their grips lingered longer than necessary. Their breaths mingled in the closeness of struggle. Their gazes locked with a heat that was not only rivalry, but desire. Each blow, each hold, each press of flesh against flesh carried not only defiance, but recognition. They were mirrors of one another, two halves of a whole that had always been incomplete. The struggle did not end in victory, but in revelation. For as their strength met, as their wills clashed, both men felt the spark of something neither had known before: equality. Gilgamesh, who had subdued every rival, felt his body tremble not with dominance, but with the thrill of finally being seen, finally being touched in a way that unsettled his solitude. Enkidu, who had lived free yet lonely in the wild, felt his heart pound not only with defiance, but with belonging. As though in this collision he had found the one who could truly know him. Desire flickered between them, not only the desire of flesh, though that burned hot and undeniable, but the deeper desire of souls recognizing their counterpart. Theirs was a longing that blurred the boundaries between love and rivalry, between intimacy and conflict. To see one another was to ache for closeness even as they pushed against it, to crave union even as they fought to define it. The city watched, but the city did not see what truly unfolded. They saw two bodies locked in combat, dust rising, muscles straining, sweat gleaming. They did not see the undercurrent, the way Gilgamesh's arrogance faltered into awe, the way Enkidu's defiance softened into fascination, the way violence transformed into intimacy. When at last they broke apart, panting, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and something more, neither claimed victory. Instead, they stood in silence, eyes locked, breath heavy, chests rising and falling in rhythm. The crowd whispered of strength, but the truth was deeper. In that moment, they had tasted what it meant to be equal, to be mirrored, to be known. This was the true beginning, not the end of tyranny, not yet, but the crack in its surface, not the end of wildness, but its transformation. In their conflict, desire was born.
desire that was not fleeting but eternal, not merely physical but spiritual, not simply rivalry but recognition. For in the press of flesh against flesh, in the fire of eyes locked in defiance, they discovered what they had been missing all along: the one who could stand beside them without fear, the one who could pierce their solitude, the one who could make them whole.
When the dust of their struggle finally settled, Uruk held its breath. The people, wide-eyed, waited for a victor to be named, for a final blow to be struck, yet none came. Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood face to face, their chests heaving, their bodies marked by the clash, their gazes locked in a silence more profound than war. It was here, in this charged stillness, that something greater than victory unfolded. Their struggle had not broken them apart, it had stripped them bare. Blow by blow, they had shed their solitude. Grip by grip, they had unwrapped their armor. Breath by breath, they had revealed to one another what neither had shown to any other soul: their vulnerability. Theirs was not the silence of enemies, but the silence of recognition, a silence that trembled with intimacy. Gilgamesh, for the first time, felt the fierce light of his divinity soften. For years he had ruled with arrogance, bending others to his will, but now he stood before someone who had bent yet had not broken, who had resisted yet had not fled. Enkidu's defiance had not diminished him, it had filled him, completed him. Gilgamesh felt his restlessness still, as though the storm inside him had found its echo in another's heart. And Enkidu, the Wild One, for the first time felt himself fully seen. In Gilgamesh's eyes there was no scorn, no dismissal, no domination, only recognition. He had been a child of wilderness, kin to beasts, yet never understood. Now, standing before this king who bore the weight of gods, he felt belonging. For the first time, his loneliness was answered. Their bodies remembered the struggle, even as their souls recognized the bond. Gilgamesh's hand, which had moments before grasped with force, lingered now at Enkidu's shoulder, not in dominance, but in acknowledgement. Enkidu's breath, which had roared in defiance, brushed warm against Gilgamesh's cheek, not in challenge, but in closeness. The press of their frames, still near, carried no threat. It carried the echo of intimacy, the ache of desire.
It was not a desire that demanded conquest, nor one that sought mere satisfaction. It was the desire of recognition, the desire to fuse with the one who completes what you lack, to feel in another the reflection of your own incompleteness. Their eyes held longer than necessary, not because they sought victory, but because they feared breaking the spell of that recognition. In that moment, the people of Uruk saw two men,
But the truth was deeper. The gods had woven a single soul split into two forms, and now, at last, the halves had found one another. What began as violence melted into closeness. They sat together, side by side, breath slowing, bodies still trembling from the force of their struggle. Neither spoke at first, for words would have shattered what was better expressed through silence. Their silence was not empty. It pulsed with the unspoken truths that surged between them. I see you. I feel you. You are mine and I am yours. The sensuality of their bond lived in small things, in gestures that lingered with more weight than speech. Gilgamesh's fingers brushed the back of Enkidu's hand, and though it was brief, it was charged with the heat of recognition. Enkidu's gaze traced the line of Gilgamesh's jaw, and though it was silent, it was heavy with wonder. The air between them grew thick, not with dust, but with intimacy, the kind that settles deep into the bones, that cannot be shaken away. This was the union the gods had designed, but it was more than divine intention. It was human longing answered. For Gilgamesh, Enkidu became the balm to his restlessness. No longer did he pace the walls of Uruk alone, consumed by hunger for dominance. Now he had someone who walked beside him, someone who did not bow, someone who met his gaze and steadied his storm. His aura of power was no longer tinged only with emptiness. It was warmed by companionship.
For Enkidu, Gilgamesh became the doorway into the world of human intimacy. No longer was he a creature apart, gazed at but never understood. Now he had someone who not only saw him but desired him, not for conquest but for connection. His wildness was no longer lonely. It was cherished. It was mirrored. It was needed. Together they became inseparable, each completing the other in ways no one else could. Their rivalry transformed into devotion, their struggle into a union that pulsed with both tenderness and fire. They ate together, laughed together, journeyed together, and in every gesture there lingered the memory of that first clash, where their bodies pressed and their souls touched. Theirs was a companionship laced with sensuality, not because it was reducible to flesh, but because it embraced every level of desire, body, spirit, and heart. Gilgamesh's hand on Enkidu's back as they walked was a gesture of affection, but it was also the echo of that first grip in battle. Enkidu's laughter, spilling into Gilgamesh's ear, carried the same intimacy as the warm breath he had felt during their struggle. Their every closeness carried the weight of recognition, the thrill of intimacy that was as much spiritual as it was physical. To outsiders, they were friends. To themselves, they were more. They were halves fused into a whole, rivals turned into companions, two flames that burned brighter together than alone. This was the peak of connection, the point where longing became union, where loneliness dissolved into intimacy, It was not fragile, but fierce, not fleeting, but eternal. They became the image of what all desire seeks, not simply the touch of another body, but the recognition of another soul.
And yet, woven into this peak was a shadow, though neither of them would name it then. For every union carries within it the seed of loss. Every closeness carries the reminder of impermanence. But in that moment, they did not care. In that moment, they were infinite. Their companionship became legend. Together they journeyed. Together they faced gods and monsters. Together they carved their names into eternity. But beneath the tales of conquest and adventure, the truth of their story remained this: two men who found in each other what the world could not give, an intimacy so profound it blurred the line between flesh and spirit, between rivalry and love, between mortality and the divine. At the peak of their bond, Gilgamesh and Enkidu were not king and wild man, not ruler and rival, not even merely men. They were desire embodied, desire not for dominance, but for recognition, for union, for the dissolution of solitude. They were two halves of a soul, fused through struggle, bound through intimacy, held together by a closeness that neither time nor fate could erase. And it was this bond, born of conflict and crowned in desire, that would shape the rest of their story. For companionship this fierce is both blessing and curse. It brings ecstasy, but it also invites tragedy. The gods had given Gilgamesh his equal, but in doing so, they had also given him something to lose. But for now, in the glow of their union, in the warmth of their closeness, in the silence of their recognition, there was no fear, no shadow, no thought of loss. There was only the intoxicating truth of their bond, that in one another they had found what they had always longed for. With their bond sealed, Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood no longer as rivals, but as companions, bound by a closeness so intense it startled even the gods who had woven their fates. Uruk, the city that had once trembled under the weight of its king's arrogance, now looked upon him with new eyes. For Gilgamesh, who had once walked alone in restless hunger, now walked beside another whose presence steadied his storm. The people saw the change before Gilgamesh himself did. His steps no longer struck the stones of Uruk with tyranny, but with purpose. His voice, though still commanding, carried warmth when Enkidu stood at his side. The loneliness that had sharpened his gaze softened into something deeper, an attentiveness, a spark of humanity that had been absent before. The king who once consumed the lives of others now gave of himself, because in Enkidu's gaze he had learned what it meant to be seen, and in Enkidu's touch he had learned what it meant to be held. But this bond was not meant for stillness. Desire that fierce cannot remain confined to walls, no matter how high. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu turned outward, to the world beyond Uruk, seeking adventures that would etch their companionship into eternity. It was Enkidu who first gave voice to the restlessness that stirred within them. Though the city had softened him, though companionship had filled him with belonging, The pulse of the wilderness still beat in his veins. He longed for the clash, for the raw test of strength and courage. And Gilgamesh, whose arrogance had once sought conquest alone, now felt that restlessness transformed, not hunger for domination, but hunger for shared triumph, for glory that would bind their names together as one. So they set their eyes upon the cedar forest, sacred realm of the gods, guarded by Humbaba, the monstrous sentinel. To strike Humbaba down was to court death itself, but it was also to carve a tale into eternity. Gilgamesh, once reckless in pursuit of his own satisfaction, now sought the quest not only for glory, but because Enkidu stood beside him. What he feared alone, he dared with Enkidu.
Their journey to the forest was long, and every step deepened their bond. They walked as equals, their strides falling in rhythm, their silences charged not with distance, but with the intimacy of those who no longer needed words. At night, when stars spilled across the Mesopotamian sky, they lay close, their bodies warmed by the same fire, their breaths mingling in the darkness. It was not conquest, but companionship that shaped those nights. The knowledge that in the vastness of the world they had found each other. When they reached the forest, the air thick with resin and shadow, Enkidu faltered. For the wilderness was his birthright, and Humbaba was a terror he had once known in whispers carried on the wind. His wild heart trembled, not from cowardice, but from the memory of what it meant to be prey. In his hesitation, Gilgamesh did what once would have been unthinkable. He placed his hand upon Enkidu's shoulder and spoke not as a king, but as a companion. Do not fear. We are two, and together we are more than fear. Those words, heavy with recognition, bound them even tighter. Fear that once paralyzed now melted into strength, for Enkidu was not alone. Together they entered the cedar shadows. Together they faced Humbaba, whose roar shook the heavens, whose breath was fire, whose presence was terror. The battle was fierce, their bodies pressed against danger, their voices calling to one another through the chaos. Gilgamesh's strength shone brighter because Enkidu's wildness guided it, and Enkidu's ferocity burned hotter because Gilgamesh's courage steadied it. Blow after blow, they moved not as two, but as one, until at last Humbaba fell, slain by the union of their wills. The forest groaned as the guardian's body struck the earth. Victory was theirs, and yet beneath the thrill of triumph there lingered a shadow. For the gods, who had given Gilgamesh his equal, now looked upon the bond they had forged and wondered, had they given too much? Companionship this fierce was power, and power such as this always courts the jealousy of gods.
Their bond deepened further still when the goddess Ishtar cast her eyes upon Gilgamesh. She desired him, the radiant king, and offered him her hand, her power, her passion. But Gilgamesh, changed by Enkidu's presence, refused. He saw in her promise not fulfillment, but emptiness, not intimacy, but conquest. His heart no longer ached for shallow unions. It beat only for the bond that already filled him. Ishtar, enraged by rejection, sent down the bull of heaven, a beast whose hooves shattered earth and whose breath scorched the fields. Yet again, Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood together, shoulder to shoulder, their bodies pressed in defiance against divine wrath. And together they struck it down, their laughter mingling even in the face of a god's fury. But it was this defiance that sealed their fate. For in striking the bull of heaven, they had wounded the pride of the gods themselves. And the gods who grant companionship are also those who take it away. In the nights that followed, as Uruk rejoiced in victory, a heaviness hung over the air. Neither Gilgamesh nor Enkidu named it, but both felt it, the weight of inevitability, the shadow of loss. Passion this fierce, intimacy this consuming, was too much for the mortal world to contain. One of them would be taken. Gilgamesh, though softened by love, could not voice his fear. He touched Enkidu's hand longer than before, lingered in his gaze more often, as though to drink every moment, to carve it into memory. Enkidu, though wild and untamed, sensed the shift in the winds, yet he smiled into it, as though his laughter could hold back fate.
This was the tragedy seeded within their triumph, that in finding one another, they had given the gods a reason to intervene. And though they did not yet know whose name would be called, they knew the call would come. For companionship this profound is a gift, but it is also a test. To love so fiercely is to place oneself in the hands of loss, to bind one's soul not only to joy, but to grief. The people of Uruk celebrated two heroes. The gods prepared to take one. And so though Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood hand in hand, their bond radiant, their love undeniable, the shadow of tragedy lay just beyond the horizon. Their adventures had proven their unity, their victories had sung their closeness to the heavens. And it was precisely because of this closeness that the world would never allow it to remain unbroken. Theirs was a companionship that shook the balance of gods and men alike. It softened a tyrant. It humanized a king. It gave voice to wilderness and rooted divinity in the soil of humanity. But passion so fierce, love so consuming, always courts its end. And soon the end would come.
The story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu does not end with their triumphs, nor with their laughter ringing against the walls of Uruk. It ends with silence, with the weight of absence, with the aching truth that even the most radiant bonds cannot escape the hands of fate. Enkidu, the wild one who had tamed a king, the untamed force who had humanized the divine, was struck down.
illness, sent by the gods as retribution, withered the strength in his limbs, dimmed the fire in his eyes, and carried him toward the darkness from which no man returns. Gilgamesh, who had once known only conquest, now knew fear, not of battle, not of death upon the field, but of losing the one whose presence had become the pulse of his own life. He held Enkidu as the wildness drained from him, as the laughter fell silent, as breath slowed into stillness. He touched his hair, his chest, his hand, desperate to anchor him to the world. But no touch, no cry, no plea could alter the decree of gods. And when Enkidu's eyes closed for the last time, Gilgamesh felt the truth of mortality pierce deeper than any spear. For what is a king without his equal? What is a man without the one who makes him whole? The tale lingers on Gilgamesh wandering after Enkidu's death, his heart fractured, his steps driven not by conquest but by grief. He searched for immortality, for some way to defy the finality that had stolen his companion, but every answer he found was sand slipping through his fingers. The gods had given him 2/3 divinity, but the 1/3 that was mortal could not be denied. His body, like Enkidu's, was destined to return to dust. His love, fierce as it was, could not prevent loss. And yet, this is where the myth reveals its deepest truth.
For though Enkidu's body was gone, his presence endured. Every step Gilgamesh took carried the echo of their bond. Every glance at the city walls of Uruk reminded him that they had once walked together, that his loneliness had once been broken, that his soul had once been mirrored. Love does not erase mortality, it makes mortality bearable. It does not conquer time, it gives time its weight. The fragility of their companionship is precisely what made it sacred. If it had lasted forever, it would not have burned so brightly. If Enkidu had not been taken, Gilgamesh would not have discovered the aching beauty of being human. Love transformed him, and loss defined him. This is the paradox that every heart must face, that the deeper the love, the sharper the grief, that every moment of closeness already contains its ending, that in the very act of loving we consent to eventual loss, and yet we love because in that fleeting union we glimpse eternity. The myth of Gilgamesh and Enkidu is not only the story of a king and a wild man, it is the story of us all. We long for connection as Gilgamesh did, restless in our solitude. We seek mirrors of ourselves in others, souls that recognize us, bodies that steady us, voices that quiet the storms inside. And when we find them, the world itself feels transformed. Tyrants soften, wilderness finds home, divinity humbles itself before touch. For a time, love makes us more than we are. But like Gilgamesh, we must face that such bonds do not last. Lovers part, friends are taken. Time moves merciless and tender,
and leaves us with memories in place of presence. And yet it is precisely because of this fragility that love feels eternal. Its impermanence is the seed of its sanctity. To love is to ache, and to ache is to live.
Gilgamesh's grief teaches us that the value of love is not measured in its duration, but in its depth. A bond that lasts a season can transform more than a lifetime of solitude. A touch, a gaze, a shared breath can alter the shape of a soul forever. Enkidu's death shattered Gilgamesh, but it also revealed to him and to us that in desire, in companionship, and in grief, we discover what it means to be human. The gods withheld immortality from Gilgamesh. They denied him the ability to hold Enkidu forever. But in doing so, they gave him something greater: the understanding that love itself is a form of eternity. Not in the body, not in the unbroken chain of years, but in the way one soul, once joined to another, is never truly alone again. The myth closes not with conquest, not with victory, but with yearning. A yearning that resonates across centuries, across cultures, across every heart that has ever loved and lost. We feel it because it mirrors our own lives. We too have found companions who softened us, who steadied us, who transformed us. We too have faced the silence left in their absence, and we too have walked forward carrying their presence in memory, in longing, in love. That is why this tale endures, not because Gilgamesh slew Humbaba, not because he built the walls of Uruk, but because he loved and lost, as we all must. Because he discovered that to be human is to live between desire and grief, between ecstasy and absence, between touch and memory. And so we listen to this myth not as strangers to its sorrow, but as kin to it. We recognize ourselves in Gilgamesh's longing, in Enkidu's wild laughter, in their closeness, in their loss. The story is theirs, but it is also ours. Perhaps that is the hidden gift of mythology, that in listening to these ancient tales, we discover mirrors of our own souls. They remind us that even gods cannot grant immunity from loss, that even kings must bow before mortality. They remind us that love is always fragile, always fleeting, and yet always sacred. And so the tale of Gilgamesh and Enkidu lingers in the air like a sigh, like the warmth of a hand that has slipped away but still burns upon the skin. It leaves us yearning, because yearning is the proof of love. It leaves us grieving, because grief is the proof of humanity. To love, to lose, to remember, that is the story of Gilgamesh. That is the story of us all. And as the myth closes, The silence it leaves is not empty, but full, full of echoes, of memory, of longing, full of the truth that though we cannot escape mortality, we can transcend it in the depth of our bonds. For in desire, in love, in grief, we touch the eternal. And that is what it means to be human.